giving advice and insight on the coronavirus. Everyone is coming up to you and saying, how is everything going? We've been in this sobering period for a while. If you had the opportunity to talk to New Yorkers, what would be your urgent message right now about where things stand?
Well, specifically to New Yorkers, and being a New Yorker myself, I can really feel it. Have been through a very painful, terrible period and still are going through it. I mean, of all the places in the world that have gotten hit the hardest, unfortunately, my hometown of New York and the New York City metropolitan area has. But things are starting to turn around. I mean, even though the number of deaths are very disturbing each day that we get the report, if you look at the number of new infections, hospitalizations, need for intensive care, that is not only flattened, but it's starting to come down. So I think there's a degree of light at the end of the tunnel. The only thing we have to be careful about is that we don't want to jump the gun and say, well, okay, we're over this hill. We're not. There's still a lot of things that need to be done to mitigate the further spread. But New York has been through a lot.
In that regard, Doctor, you have repeatedly said the virus sets the timeline. Not a doctor, not a scientist, not a politician. What is the virus telling you about the timeline right now?
Well, right now, the virus is telling us about the timeline that there really is a difference throughout the country, because we have a big country and we have different cities and different regions which have really had different dynamics of the outbreak. New York is clearly different than what we've seen in the state of Washington and in California. We have New Orleans, we have Chicago, we have Detroit. And then we have areas of the country, in the middle of the country, Midwest, plains areas, mountain regions, where the level of infection is really very low compared to what we've seen in places like New York City. So what we have to do is we have to try very carefully to get back to some degree of normality. But if we prematurely jump the gun and say, well, we've been through mitigation. Mitigation is the kind of physical separation that everybody's familiar with, because it has really transformed and completely changed the way we interact in society. 6 feet difference, no crowds more than 10, restaurants close, bars close, etc. In an attempt to somehow get back to normal, there's a multi-step process that came out a few days ago, which is the returning and reopening of America. But it has to be done really carefully. It's not a light switch that you turn on and off. And people in New York City, because you're still going through a lot, have to be really prudent and careful about pulling back on mitigation before you actually have the virus really going dramatically down for at least a couple of weeks in a row. So people get confused. They think it's the United States. We're all going to do the same thing at the same time. It's not. It's got to be different and dependent upon the situation in your particular region, state, or city.
So in terms of Governor Cuomo saying in recent days that he believes that New York has plateaued and maybe on the other side of the plateau, what you're saying is we can't predict how long that descent, so to speak, might take.
We can't, but from experience, what we've seen in other cities throughout the world, such as cities in China, cities in Europe, particularly in Italy, which has gotten particularly hard hit, you know that once you turn around, if you keep the mitigation, separation, physical separation, the steep should be dramatic. So it goes up like this, it plateaus there for a while, then it starts to come down. And if you keep putting your foot on the accelerator of mitigation, it should sharply come down. Only when it's clear that there's no doubt it's going steeply down, then you could start thinking about, should I be tiptoeing into a little bit of relaxation of the restrictions?
Dr. Fauci, you mentioned reopening, and in recent days, there's been discussion and speculation about how could a sport like Major League Baseball return and begin its 2020 season? Under what scenario could you see that happening?
Well, to be quite frank with you, it is impossible to predict, but given the extraordinary efficiency of transmissibility of this virus, I don't think we can say with any confidence that in the middle of this summer, we could say, okay, July 4th, let's start the season in a truncated season, exactly the way we would do it normally, because there's going to be a new normal for a while. And it's not going to be just a few months. It likely will cycle around even into next fall and winter. Hopefully it'll go way down. So what are some of the possibilities? People who know more about baseball structure than I do have said it, but I think it's reasonable. You could either have a situation where you get the group of players and you put them in a few cities, you make sure they're not infected, you test them so that they don't infect each other. And you have baseball as much as it's tough to say, in a spectator-less environment, where you have people playing in an environment in which people can watch it on television. I mean, the revenues are not going to be the same as when you have a packed stadium like Nats Stadium in Washington, where I go to. But I think having them play on television is certainly better than nothing. Another version of that is to limit the amount of people in a stadium and make sure you seat them in a way where they are really quite separated, and maybe even wearing the facial covers that are masks. I know people look at that and they say, what are you, crazy? But to me, it's better than no baseball at all. That's the point.
Right. I wanted to latch on to the last thing you said. I've spoken to some baseball executives who have said, obviously, they want to get the sport back, but they also need the revenue from having some of the fans come to the game to try and keep the sport in a place where it can operate well financially. So that scenario where fans came to the game, could a sport follow the president's guidelines, follow some of those guidelines that have been put out, and have masks and have gloves and do the social distancing, and perhaps, as you said, have fewer people at the game, but you would still be able to have some fans at the game?
That is possible. But as you said, and I affirmed what I have been saying, it's going to be the virus that determines what the timetable is. Because if we get the virus under really good control and certain regions of the country can get gradually from the gateway to the phase 1, to the phase 2, to the phase 3, it is conceivable that you may be able to have some baseball with people practicing physical separation. Namely, you don't pack a stadium. I think quite likely, although it's always dangerous to predict, I think it's more likely that you're going to have more of a television baseball than a spectator baseball.
I know you're a big baseball fan. We talked a little bit before the interview. What would be your comfort level in going to a game? And I know you can't go right now if you're working too hard, but what would make you comfortable about being able to attend a game? How would Dr. FAUCI social distance, wear a mask going forward?
Well, I would feel that there would have to be a completion of the multiple phases of the re-entering into some degree of normality. And even when you get to phase 3, it still requires a degree of physical separation. So I'd have to be in a city where the level of infection is so low that if someone gets infected, that region, that health department has the capability of identifying, isolating, and contact tracing so that person does not inadvertently infect someone else. Even with that, I cannot see a return this year to what we consider normal. There would have to be some degree, and that depends on the level of infection. Like I said, it could be as stringent as only television, or it could be in the stadium with significant difference of space between people, and even then wearing a facial covering.
Dr. FAUCI, I know we're talking about the science of it and how many obstacles would have to be overcome, but you're a passionate baseball fan. How much do you believe in the healing power of a sport like baseball and people who have been down and depressed actually having something to latch onto and the ability to watch a baseball game?
Oh, I mean, I feel very strongly about that. I mean, I love baseball. I played baseball in the Sandlot Leagues, the Coney Island League in New York City, and I love watching it. I mean, I'm a very strong baseball fan. I just love the rhythm of the game. It soothes me. I mean, when I'm really stressed, and now I go to Nats Stadium and sit down and just, watch Max and watch Steve and the others, it makes me really feel good.
So you grew up in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. You grew up as a Yankee fan. What are your recollections about those days and how that Yankee fandom grew in Brooklyn?
Well, again, I think people who don't come from the New York area, at least are not old like I am and come from the New York area, don't realize that back then, that half the people in Brooklyn were Yankee fans. And there was a wonderful competitiveness and rivalry between the friends who were Dodger fans versus Yankee fans. And we had a whole culture. I mean, it was Duke Snider versus Mickey Mantle, Yogi Berra versus Roy Campanella, Pee Wee Reese versus Phil Rizzuto. We used to follow their batting averages that I could tell you on any given day in elementary school exactly what the point up or down in Yogi Berra's average was, or Mickey Mantle, or anybody.
You were just a kid,
Right.
and the Yankees win 5 straight World Series titles. How much were you able to gloat at that point to your friends who might have been Dodger fans or Giant fans?
Well, we always would stick it to our Dodger fans, friends, and we were all friends. I mean, we loved each other, but we were definitely different in baseball until the Dodgers won that year and just Brooklyn exploded. But, you know, I was really had a misperception. Being a Yankee fan, I thought it's natural for your team to win every year. And then it became clear that that's not the case. Right.
Now, I've mentioned a couple of times you're working 19, 20-hour days, but in the past, when you've had some free time, how often do you like to go to the ballpark? And when you go, what is it about the game and the nuances of the game that are so attractive to you?
Well, you know, I go to Nats games, I would say maybe 10, 12 times a year, and I watch 50 games on television. And there's something about the ballpark. I mean, for example, I think every baseball park has got a tradition and a beauty to it. But there's something about walking into the stadium, you know, with the neatly manicured grass and everything perfect out there, and just sitting down, getting a hot dog and a beer, and just getting into the rhythm of the game. I mean, there's something about baseball that if you love it, you know, some people say it's too slow, but, you know, it's not really. It's not. I mean, I'm not sure about the pitchers who take all day to throw a pitch, but for the most part, the rhythm is good. And then the excitement, it goes from, you know, nothing happening and then all of a sudden an explosion. So you have those sitting there, relaxing, getting into the groove, and then all of a sudden there's massive excitement. So, I mean, to me, there's almost very few things as good as that.
I couldn't have said it any better than you, by the way. Anyone who thinks baseball is slow, they're following the wrong sport. In terms of your background and being a passionate baseball fan and having played baseball, you were the captain of your high school basketball team at Regis in Manhattan. How did your sports experience, teamwork, leadership, competitiveness, how did all of that help you in the role that you have now?
I think it was very important. I mean, there are several things in my upbringing that I think have helped me in every aspect of my career, but even particularly now through the incredible stress and challenge that we're going through now with this pandemic of COVID-19. But, you know, sports is something in which particularly something like basketball and baseball, where, you know, it's something that requires individual effort, but your individual effort contributes to a bigger thing than you. So, I mean, I could say in my, you know, particularly as in basketball, you know, which is a lot of back and forth within a team. I mean, you could be a high scorer, or you could have a big hot game, but at the end of the day, if you're not doing it to win the game for the team, then you might as well really not be doing it. So it's the idea of a goal, having teammates, and being an important contributor to it. It very much gears you, and also losing. I mean, that's an important point. When you play sports, you win and it feels great, but you lose. And sometimes the losing, you know, spurs you on and inspires you to do better next time. And that's why I like in a basketball season, you always play every team twice. You get a chance to get them in high school. You don't play them once.
I've interviewed many major league players who say that the pain of the loss sometimes stays with them more than the joy of the victory. So I understand the lesson you talked about there. Dr. Fauci, you described baseball so well. You know as well as I do that in baseball, shaking hands, high fives, all of that is as prevalent as the balls and the strikes. Going forward with all that we've endured with coronavirus, would you advocate an elimination of that?
You know, I think for the time being, in what we're going through until we have a vaccine that really wipes this out, and when we have virus circulating, I think the most important thing is to wash your hands frequently. But, you know, you can't get to a sink and a soap as often as you want. You could use Purell and do the appropriate things. But I think it's prudent, at least right now, to avoid handshaking. It really is something that is such an efficient way to spread viruses. I think for now we need to do that.
I've watched a lot of your interviews, and I know that we're still learning about this virus. For someone who has already had the virus and conquered it, can that person feel as if he or she is immune going forward?
Yeah. The answer to that is very likely yes, but we haven't proven it. And let me explain what I mean. Most viruses, and we have experience with a lot of viruses, that when you get infected with a virus and you recover and you clear the virus, that you develop an immune response, usually antibodies, that protects you for variable periods of time. And it varies from virus to virus. I mean, measles, if you get infected with measles like I did when I was a kid, because I was born before vaccines were available, that you can have immunity for life, that you will never get infected again. Other infections, the immunity lasts variable periods of time. So I think we can assume you're protected, but we don't know that as a fact yet. Studies would have to show that. And we also don't know how long. So it may be you're protected for a month or two, or 3 or 6 or a year, but we don't know that. So I still think, although you've been protected until we've proven it, and you feel that you want to go back to a normal way, you should still practice some degree of social distancing.
Dr. Fauci, the New York Times described you as the explainer in chief for your ability to speak bluntly and truthfully on all of these topics for all Americans, but especially New Yorkers who are going through this pandemic and saying, well, what should I do now? How should I behave now? What am I supposed to do? What are some of the things on that list? I know you've mentioned it, washing hands, covering your face. Are there any other specifics that people should be aware of?
You know, yes, and it's easy to do. You know, if you go to the cdc.gov or the coronavirus.gov, they have the, 4 or 5 key things. The biggest thing is social distancing. 6 feet away, if you're out in public, put a covering on. It doesn't need to be a surgical mask. Wash your hands frequently. Don't go in any crowded places. I mean, obviously restaurants are out, bars are out. Yeah, we know it's really tough. It's tough personally because you feel like, my goodness, my life has been completely transformed. It's also tough from an economic standpoint. People are losing their jobs. There's a lot of unemployment. But right now, New Yorkers particularly are in a particularly difficult situation. You guys and ladies have been hit harder than anybody else in the world when you look at what's happened. And that's a big burden. But you're going to get over it. I mean, I always say when people talk about it, I'm a New Yorker, so I could say it. We're tough. We've been through 9/11. We've been through a lot.
You talk about those New Yorkers, and as I close out here, you're a Bensonhurst, Brooklyn guy, and everyone that I spoke to, I said I was going to have the opportunity to interview Dr. Fauci. They want to know, when is this going to be over? Where's the glimmer of hope? Where's the light at the end of the tunnel? I know you're a man of science. I know you're very cautious, but what would be some reassuring or encouraging words that you would have for the people who are still very concerned, very worried?
Right. The encouraging words that I have right now is the pattern that I'm seeing in New York. I think Governor Cuomo just yesterday said it very well. If you look at the dynamics of what's happening, it seems to have plateaued and starting to come down. It's going to take a little while until it gets down low enough that you're going to feel less frightened about even going out. And that's why the guidelines for the reopening of the country are very gradual from step to step. This will end, my fellow New Yorkers, this will end for sure. It's going to take time. You have been amazingly good and courageous about it, particularly the incredible healthcare workers in New York who've put their lives and their health on the line every day to take care of the people who've been affected. It's been a terrible ordeal, but it will end. We will get back to normal someday.
I'm glad you mentioned the healthcare workers, and I'm glad you left us with that final headline of this will end. Dr. Fauci, it was a pleasure to talk to you. We know how busy you are, and on behalf of everyone at the YES Network, I just want to thank you for sharing your time with us.
Thank you. It's good to be with you. Thank you for having me.